Hello and welcome back to A Moment of Focus, your go-to compliance podcast where we'll continue to bring you the latest and greatest compliance updates and available resources. I'm your host, Caleb Diaz. Now let's talk compliance. All right, so recently the U.S. Department of Labor, or DOL, issued a new exemption for fiduciary investment advice providers under Title I of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, or ERISA, and the Internal Revenue Code, called Improving Investment Advice for Workers and Retirees, also known as PTE 2020-02. This prohibited transaction exemption allows investment advisors and broker-dealers to receive otherwise prohibited compensation. So now, think you don't provide advice that is conflicted? Well, hold your horses, as the DOL changed its interpretation of the 5-part fiduciary test in the exemption's preamble and now holds that a rollover recommendation may be ERISA fiduciary investment advice if the rollover advice is the first interaction in a reoccurring relationship, thus satisfying the regular basis prong of the 5-part test. Now, to add a little color to the conversation and give it extra guidance and perspective, we've brought in George Sepsakos of the Groom Law Group. George, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us today.
Thanks, Caleb. Pleasure to meet you.
Well, thanks, George. It's nice to meet you, too. Now, let's dive into our first question of the day, which is a simple but important one. What should advisors consider to determine applicability?
Sure, and that's a great question and one that we're getting a lot of nowadays. The exemption provides relief to fiduciaries who provide investment advice from the prohibited transaction rules under ERISA and the code. So the exemption provides pretty broad relief, meaning that it covers a wide range of potential conflicts of interest that an advisor may have. So depending on the nature of the transaction and if there is a potential conflict, the exemption could be applicable to the advisor. I do see a bit of confusion out in the marketplace in terms of what the exemption is, given all the history and background that's been behind this regulatory effort over the last, almost decade now. So, I think it's important for advisors to remember this exemption provides a way to comply with the prohibited transaction rules under ERISA and the code, as I mentioned before. So despite some of the language in the preamble that folks have been concerned about how the Labor Department has interpreted the existing 5-part test, the actual exemption itself provides relief from those prohibited transaction rules. So when determining whether this exemption is applicable, the first question that all of us need to be asking is, am I a fiduciary when engaging in this conduct? If the answer is yes, then you need to move on to whether you need an exemption and whether you need to use this exemption. If the answer is no, you can basically stop the inquiry. But assuming that the answer is yes, and you are acting as a fiduciary, the question needs to be, whether you've got a conflict of interest that could result in a potential prohibited transaction. So, as an example, in the ordinary course, an advisor providing investment advice to a retirement plan or IRA, will be acting as a fiduciary. And so, they have to evaluate whether they have a conflict of interest. If they're receiving a flat basis point fee for providing advice to the plan or IRA, the exemption won't be necessary because there's not a conflict that would otherwise result in a prohibited transaction. However, to the extent that the advisor, has proprietary funds where, they may receive additional fees, there could be a conflict where, this exemption comes into play. So using that as an example, this exemption could be used for advisors who might want to recommend clients invest in, limited partnerships where they, may play a role where there previously was an exemption, except otherwise to level your compensation. But really, I think that the area that this exemption is truly focused and is truly applicable, and the area that's garnered the most attention is on rollover. So there, the question when an advisor is talking to a client or prospective client is, am I acting as a fiduciary when I'm having that conversation? And, that's going to be a very fact-specific inquiry. That depends on whether the advisor is making a recommendation when they're having that discussion the Labor Department's reinterpreted the regular basis prong of the five-part test to effectively say that, initial conversations between an advisor or any financial institution or, regulated entity dealing with, retirement investments can be viewed as fiduciary advice. That initial conversation can be viewed as fiduciary advice if the ongoing relationship would be one of trust and confidence. Now, I think that's flawed personally for several reasons. I think it undermines prior agencies' positions and core positions on that point. And if you go back to 2015, the Labor Department explicitly described that they needed to amend the definition of fiduciary because of this regular basis prong. But anyway, they've decided to interpret this within a preamble to say something different. So, I'm personally dubious, but that is the Labor Department's position. So everyone's going to need to determine whether they're acting as a fiduciary when engaging in kind of rollover conversations. So if you are, you'll need to comply with the exemption.
Thank you, George. I know it was a fairly broad question, but giving our listeners that initial compliance framework is so useful. So we really appreciate you breaking it down for us. Now, moving on, if this does apply to an advisor, what is a time frame for compliance?
Sure. So the exemption is actually effective today, meaning that advisors could decide to begin to use the exemption now if they so choose. However, I think most advisors who may have a conflict that would need the exemption are still relying on the DOL Field Assistance Bulletin 2018-02, which provides effectively a non-enforcement policy that was issued by the Labor Department, now over 3 years ago, which says if you're complying with the impartial conduct standards, meaning the best interest standard, you're receiving no more than reasonable compensation, and you're transacting using best execution, that the Labor Department won't pursue claims against you. That non-enforcement policy expires in late December of 2021. So at that time, if you're a fiduciary providing investment advice and you have a potential conflict, you'll need to comply with the exemption to manage those conflicts of interest, or engaging in otherwise prohibited transactions with parties in interest under ERISA in the code. So I would circle the end of December for most advisors as the time frame when they need to come into compliance.
Got it. So it's effective now, but there is a 2021 December compliance date. Now, with that time frame in mind, I think advisors are going to want to start thinking about practical ways to move forward. Can you share some advice and guidance on where to begin?
Yeah, so as we talked about a little bit beforehand, the first question that all advisors need to think through is whether they're acting as a fiduciary that would require the use of the exemption. So, focusing on rollover conversations for the time being, I think, we all need to think through what your advisors are doing when they're having those conversations. So some advisors who want to avoid acting as a fiduciary for purposes of rollovers are putting pretty specific collars around conversations that folks can have. So, an example of that might be, you can sell yourself, you can sell, that you obviously provide advice and that you're willing to take on new clients or new assets. But, the moment that the question is asked, whether and how the assets would be invested, that's when a conversation would effectively have to shut down, or, we need to take a different path. So, that's one thing that folks have been doing, is just thinking about whether they want to be fiduciaries for purposes of those rollover conversations, and potentially putting collars around conversations that folks can have. However, there's a lot of folks out there who really see no way around being a fiduciary when engaging in those conversations, or, they're simply willing to do it. I think moving forward with, compliance with the exemption probably makes some sense. So, if you look at the exemption, it's broken down into several components, but there's a couple of key issues that really need to be solved, right off the bat, right off the box. Again, just focusing on rollovers. If you're providing, rollover recommendations, advisors are going to need to provide a fiduciary acknowledgement and will need to document that the rollover recommendation is in the best interest of the client. And there's, some specific things that advisors can look at. And, I think we've got a short one pager that we can share with folks to kind of supplement the process. But, after that, I think advisors need to kind of consider policies and procedures that they have around conflicts of interest internally. Some of that is going to be advisor specific, and some advisors may have, particularly those with dual registrations, may have already done some work, on those conflicts and those policies under Reg BI, but those will need to be taken a look at and, evaluated, for compliance. So I think those are kind of the, places to start and to begin when thinking through, what a compliance framework would look like, to comply with the exemption.
Oh, definitely. Thinking about it in a systematic way is really great advice. Thank you, George. Now, moving on to our last question of the day, what is the likelihood of enforcement by the DOL?
Yeah, so the Labor Department currently investigates and enforces ERISA issues all of the time. And the Labor Department has enforcement jurisdiction over plans, but they only have interpretive jurisdiction, meaning that they can explain what they believe the law is over IRAs. So they currently are unable to enforce the law as it relates to IRA transactions. That would fall within the ambit of the IRS. The Labor Department has begun shifting resources to investigate service providers on a broader basis, frankly, because they get more bang for the buck than investigating individual plans. So, the Labor Department does have a national enforcement initiative on plan conflicts that's been there really forever, but it's been focused on other issues because of the regulatory uncertainty, particularly on rollover issues. So I think that enforcement, particularly in the plan area and rollovers out of plans, is coming sooner than later. I kind of piggybacking on what I was just saying, the Labor Department has focused more on regulation recently, and I think they will continue to redefine the definition of a fiduciary. The statements within the preamble to the exemption about how they interpret the definition of a fiduciary, I don't think are all that robust, nor will they be able to really enforce those positions. But I think they will likely move to redefine that definition formally through a regulation. I think they're also going to amend other exemptions that we currently rely on, through 8424 for the sale of annuity products, or 77.4, which provides an exemption for the sale of proprietary mutual funds. But eventually they're going to turn to enforcement on this, and when they do, I think we can learn from other enforcement actions that they've taken and understand that it's going to be a very detailed and specific inquiry. So I think that means we'll all need to be prepared if and when that happens. But I think that is probably coming in the next few years as the Labor Department gets up to speed.
Thank you, George. That makes a lot of sense. And I really appreciate you reinforcing the need for advisors to be prepared. And with that, George, I just want to say thanks again so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with us and really offer some excellent guidance and perspective that I think our clients are really going to appreciate.
Thanks so much, Caleb. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I really appreciate you guys having me on.
Of course, George. You're always welcome on the podcast. Now, with that, we are done for the day, so make sure to check out the links below to any supplements or documents that we talked about in the podcast. Make sure to also check us out on LinkedIn, YouTube, and your Dash7 dashboard if you are a Focus One client. Have a great week, everyone, and stay compliant.